Welcome to AlexGs Aquarium, everybody. Today will be part 3 of the DIY needle wheel impeller series. Last time, if you tuned in, I made acrylic discs for two different types of needle wheel impellers. The first one's more of a traditional one, which is kind of a half-finished one I never got around to completing, which will get completed today. And this one's just going to have needles sticking straight out from it. The other version is a double layer disc, which I've kind of pieced one together here ever so slightly. It's not glued yet, but this one will have a top and a bottom disc on it, and this will have 1/8 inch and 1/16 inch needles in it. As a matter of fact, the first thing that we're going to do today is get one of these ready to glue. Now, when we finished off the last video, I had made 2 of these double discs, and I had 4 pins that I had put in each one of them in order to make sure that I could keep all the hole pattern the same on both discs. Now, while this does work, one of the things you might be noticing here is that there's kind of a white area on this half of it. What that is when the drill was going through, if there was any kind of gap between the 2 discs, it would actually push some of the drill shavings in between the 2 discs. Now, it won't hurt anything while you're drilling the pattern out, but what it does do is cause something that will be ultimately an obstruction that needs to be removed. Therefore, we need to pull these 2 discs apart, clean off these excess shavings of acrylic, and then refit the disc together. But what I want to do first is get it prepped up like this one. I want to use the 4 pins that are in it now, and then put an additional 4 in, so I have 8 pins total holding it up. Get the disc standing up the way that it should so that we can go ahead and get it glued. Once this is glued, be able to go through and start putting all the other needles in around the disc. First step you want to do with this is just get a marker of some kind and make a couple of marks. Doesn't have to be anything really heavy. Just want a couple of marks on here so that you know where a couple of these points are. The next step we have to take is to separate these. Now, the easiest place will be where it's already come apart just a bit. You're going to hear a little bit of acrylic noise here as the shavings kind of break off between the discs. That's okay. It's not a problem. Just take your time and be gentle. Just separated. If you can, try to keep them lined up so that you're not going to have any interference. Now, as far as removing these little acrylic pieces, you could use your fingernail. They should come off easily. If you don't want to do that, you could just use a tip of a screwdriver. The same exact thing here. We just have some little acrylic shavings on here that we want to get off. With all the plastic shavings off, all you gotta do is keep these 4 pins in on this side, and then you could realign it just how it was. Now, I tend to try and keep these discs together always if I can, because you don't want them to get separated. You want to try and keep them together. This is the result that we want to get to now, is having this disc with its double layer on here, and you can see one of the pins is not fitting in there super tight, but we want to get this to where we get it spaced out properly. The final step we need to take with the drill press before we get into putting the needles onto the impellers is getting the final hole drilled to fit the impeller shaft. Now, you want this to be an extremely tight fit. I recommend, if you have a machinist drill set, this is where it's going to probably become the most handy, so that you have all the little tiny increments of drill sizes. That is what allowed me to do this. I found one that was able to press it on and allow it to stick on there with a little bit of resistance. I didn't want anything that really had to be forced on, because I don't want to risk cracking the ceramic shaft. On this Jabo pump, it is a keyed shaft. We'll talk about that later. Since I'm not going to cut a keyhole in here to fit that perfect, it's okay. A round hole will work. We will insert a key into that later so that it can't free spin from the impeller shaft. As I found out with my first one in trials, it will eventually wear out this hole enough to where it'll start to free spin, just because of the resistance with the water in the impeller and the impeller shaft. All that you need to do here is find the appropriate drill bit, press it in, give it a backward spin around. It will help you to find out where the center of your hole is. You could also do measurements and everything too. I've used this little technique before. It's worked fine for me. The only thing that has to be done now is to hold this down and drill it. Just want to take this nice and slow. You don't want to go quickly. Once that one's done, I'm going to drill the other two impellers that I've drilled out. Then we'll move on to the next step of putting the needles onto these impellers. Now it's time to take the next step of getting the needles glued into here. Let's go back downstairs and start working on that. We've gotten both the discs cleaned off so that there's no excess acrylic in here. I've gone ahead though and put 8 needles onto this one. 4 of them are the orange you can see, which are my references, which I use to put these 2 discs together. Now one of them, well, a couple of them here are a little loose, so I'm gonna move those over. It's okay if they are. The important thing is that all the holes line up all the way around both discs. I'm going to start though by taking this needle wheel impeller that doesn't have any needles cut for it to size, and I'll show you guys real quick how I cut them. It's very simple. Once I have those, I'm going to cut 4 red ones and 4 clear ones. With that, I'll get them inserted in here, and then we'll raise both these discs up to their final height. Give them a little touch of acrylic glue, which I have just a little bit in a bottle here, so we can touch that on, get these done, let them sit overnight. I'm just going to review this part real quick. I've got my square set up for just under 15/16. Probably knocked about a 32nd of an inch off of it, because when you cut this it tends to be slightly longer. I'm just going to line this up here, take my cutters, and this is kind of awkward because this is the angle I normally do this on. Go all the way to the back and cut. Just a couple more times. You don't want to use the tip because it'll shatter the rod a little bit. When you want to go all the way to the back of the cutter, and it'll give it a fairly clean break on there, which is what we're looking for. It doesn't have to be exactly perfect. Don't worry if it's slightly off. The big thing is that you use something that allows you to cut the same size needles over and over again. On these needle wheel impellers, the needles are going to be 15/16 of an inch long, and I'm doing that for a couple of reasons. One, I took the old impeller that was in here and sized it in to the volute, along with fitting it onto the impeller shaft once it's been drilled, to see how much clearance I have. This is something that, depending on the brand of pump that you have, you might have to do a little bit of experimentation with. So my suggestion is that once you think you have a size for the needles that you're going to be putting on there, put them on the outside edge, just a handful of them, dry fit the impeller onto the shaft, put the volute back on, screw it on all the way just like it would be. Now I'm not saying turn the pump on, I wouldn't do that yet. Leave it unplugged and take a look at the clearance you could see down the top of the volute, and then if you can, see if you could turn the impeller inside there. See if you feel it rubbing against anything, or see if there's something that looks like it doesn't have a lot of clearance. Now these impellers in some cases do have a little bit of slack forward and backward. Take that into account when you're building these impellers. I'll talk more about that when I fit this, but you want to make sure that there's plenty of room for the needle wheel impeller to where it's not going to hit the volute or hit the back of the motor housing when it's spinning. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. For this Jabo 15,000, I use the 1/4 inch acrylic base, and then you want the entire thickness of the impeller to be 15/16 of an inch tall, and that's with the top on it as well, as you'll see here in a few minutes. Let's get back down to putting the needles onto the disc. Now I've pre-fitted my needles onto this one disc. I have 8 of them on here, but now we have our 4 needles here, 4 clear and 4 are the fluorescent. There's a few ways you could do this, but this comes back to why I said keep your reference points and don't separate these discs. Keep them together so you don't have a problem with them coming apart. Simply take one of them and push them out. And if it doesn't want to come out, that's okay. You can tap it out with a hammer if you want. You might have to do that with this one. Or you can go to the next hole over and fit your pins in, as I'm going to do with this one here until we get them separated. Remember, your most important part here is to keep your reference point, which as long as you have those, when you refit this together, you're going to be okay. Now we just have to pull this apart a bit. Now if your needles kind of move in and out, that's okay. That's not a big deal. It might even be a good thing at the beginning here. Take a thin screwdriver and all you want to do with this is make sure that it's relatively flat on top. And then we're ready for the final step here, which is why we have our acrylic glue out tonight. We're just going to go in real quick, and each one of these needles, we're just going to hit it. And we're just going to let that sit overnight, allow it to set up. Do the same exact thing to this one. It's been about 24 hours since I put acrylic glue onto my double layered needle wheel impellers. Now it's time for the next step, which is going to be putting all the actual needles in. Unfortunately, I don't have a better method to do it other than to say you gotta cut every single one of them by hand, as I showed earlier. I just used my little square here, adjusted it to just under 15/16 of an inch, and then I proceeded to cut every single one of them. Of course, there are several hundred to cut. It doesn't take long, it'll only take a few minutes. Let's zoom into this impeller and start looking at how the pin assembly goes. Now the fun begins here. You can see I have a nice pile of 1/8 inch needles or pins, whatever you want to call them, and then a nice pile of 1/16 inch needles or pins. And all we're going to do is insert each one. They should line up fairly good. If you want, you could just push them down with your finger. If they're not quite going, that's okay. I got a little hammer on standby just to give them that little bit of encouragement if they need it. You don't have to hit them hard. You usually don't have to hit them hard. If your alignment's slightly off, just push it over a little bit. It's in. And if for some reason it doesn't want to go in one side, you could always try going in the other. And the whole outer first row is complete. Now I'm gonna complete the inner row of 1/8 inch. Now both the inner row and the outer row have been completed. The more difficult one, of course, is going to be the 1/16 inch. Time to move on to them. There you have it. One done. It took a lot longer than I thought it would. I'll admit that. We'll montage it again. This is a lot of pins to put on here. You could use a drill bit to tap out any of the needles that you break while they're being put in, and if needed, you could always use the drill bit as well to try and reshape the hole in case any plastic got stuck in it during the drilling process. It's been about a day now since I started working on putting the needles onto the needle wheel impellers. I finished both double layers, and today I finished up one of the single layers. I figured I'd just show you guys the last one so you don't have to watch me putting pins or needles into these wheels every time. It's a pretty simple process once you get the length. Just push them in. As far as how did these go? Well, unfortunately, these double layer wheels were a little more difficult than the first one I did. When I was using the drill press and some of the acrylic was kind of melting around the hole, in some cases it did narrow it just a bit. Found that it just became a little easier to just hit them with the drill bit real quick and just to knock out any of that excess plastic that was in there. But I have both of these ready to go. There's a couple of pins in each one that are fairly loose, but I will get to gluing them. I have some acrylic glue here, which I'm going to get into my trusty little bottle. I don't put it in here often because even with this bottle being closed up as tight as it can, within a few days it'll start to noticeably evaporate until it's all gone. Matter of fact, yesterday there was a little bit of glue left in here and it's already evaporated out. I'm going to get this one done, and then we'll move on to the next step, which is gluing these impellers together. With all 4 of these impellers completed, it's time to go and do the first step of the gluing process. When it comes to gluing, I am not an expert with acrylic glue, but I can get the job done. Now I have this acrylic glue here that I purchased. This is a fast set. It's number 3, and it's got a working time of 1 minute, fixture time of 2 minutes, and 80% strength to 24 hours. We don't have to worry about the strength factor or anything, but the working time with this stuff is extremely limited. And basically all I'm going to do is, because it comes out of here basically like water, I'm just going to simply kind of slowly work it right over everything. Make sure I get every one of these pins to get a little bit of glue on them. Just so you know, when you apply the glue here, you might see a little bit of cracking. It's okay. I wouldn't be too concerned with it. Once this is all glued together as one solid piece, it's not going to very easily be pulled apart, simply because you have just well over 100 connection points between these two. So I'm going to start with the top discs to get those done, let them sit for a few minutes. Once they're done, I'll flip them and hit the back side. If you miss any of the needles in here, that's okay. If you spot a loose one later, you can go ahead and hit it with some glue later on. Same thing on these. I'm just going to take them, and there's a couple of loose pins in here, which isn't really a bad thing. You just got to take your time. I got this one flipped over now. I'm going to keep it that way. And then I'll hit the whole bottom of this as well with acrylic glue, just to make sure I get that whole thing. With the gluing all done, it's time to let these rest. Let's pick this all back up tomorrow and start talking about getting these impellers installed onto the pumps. With the gluing complete, we can now take a little step back, let these sit overnight, let all this glue cure to the full strength. Then we'll talk about getting these impellers installed onto the pump. Let's go ahead and fast forward 24 hours. Let's go ahead, fast forward 24 hours. It's been another day or so, and the impellers are all glued up now. Everything's been sitting for a couple of days actually. And a lot of other stuff I was trying to work on, trying to get a venturi for this second pump squared away, and also doing some other skimmer modifications. But now we are ready to get to the fun part. We're gonna attach these impellers to the J-boat pump. Now I have the J-boat pump impeller here, and the shaft it's just like this. There's a big ceramic shaft here. It's a keyed shaft, as I've talked about before, and then it has just a little bit of a roller that sits on top of it with a ceramic bearing here. That goes on top, so then there's just a plastic cover that goes onto it, and this locks into the plastic housing with these little teeth here, and then you have your impeller that's going to sit on here. All we're going to do to start with this is just get this pushed on. This is something that you'll have to kind of play around with once you get this going for any kind of pump that you're going to try and build this for. I strongly suggest you take the stock impeller and before you remove it, take some pictures, take some measurements of how big the gap is. Now this one basically sat all the way down onto that keyed shaft, so it had its spacing built in, but with this we don't have that. Now this will not be the final piece of assembling this impeller on here, because as I've mentioned before, this is a keyed impeller shaft. You can see on the top of the impeller shaft there's a flat point, and while I probably could have figured out a way to cut that keyed opening, I just don't think that that was worth the effort. Now initially, when I installed this impeller that's on the pump that exists on the Protein skimmer already, I didn't put any kind of key onto this impeller shaft. I decided, I said, you know, it's got a good tight fit, it shouldn't have a ton of resistance in it. Let's put it on there and see how well it works. And it worked well for quite a while. But then one day all of a sudden I stopped producing bubbles and I was trying to understand what was happening. Well, eventually it started to free spin on the impeller shaft. And at that point it becomes ineffective. We'll talk about that process later, but essentially all we're going to do for that is I'm going to cut a small little piece of acrylic as like a wedge, and then we'll keep it on here just as it's supposed to be, and then I'm going to push that little wedge on there and get it in there with a nice tight fit, and then we'll hit it with a little bit of acrylic glue, and then it's on there, and it can't spin on the shaft anymore, at least it shouldn't. All we're going to do once this is fully assembled is simply insert the magnet back in. What I do is I just give it a nice slow rotation until it locks in. And once it's locked in, you're good. Now what you'll notice once you get this in is that, see, there's a little bit of play with the impeller on here where it can kind of push in and out. It floats just a little bit. That's why I used a little piece of acrylic in here as a spacer, so that when if it does compress while the pump is on, it doesn't start direct friction against the back plate or the volute. The final piece, of course, we have to reassemble this pump. The thing you want to do is spin the impeller in here and determine if it's going to be touching anything. In this case, it's just barely touching the volute here, which is not good. I went ahead and just used this thin screwdriver to compress this down just a little bit more, because when I attached the volute the first time here, it actually was just barely touching the inside of the volute, and we definitely don't want that. That's not good for this at all. I'll reattach the volute now. The pump is now reassembled fully. Just taking my finger in here and spinning the impeller manually and making sure that it doesn't touch the volute. And we're all clear. Exactly how we should be. This pump is now ready to go. It's the moment of truth now. I have the J-Bow pump set up in the sump. It's just kind of on the side here. I figured, oh, it should work. We now have the 1-inch Venturi on here. This is with the flat face needle wheel. Let's see what it does when we take it out of feed mode on the J-Bow pump. I'm going to just keep it on the lowest setting, and let's see if we get any bubbles getting created. Alright, so this is the lowest setting on the J-Bow pump. Let's try kicking it up a few notches here. put it on full blast, see what it does. Wow, it looks like a jacuzzi in here. Wow. That is a lot of bubbles getting made by this. Wow. I think I'm going to turn this sump into a protein skimmer. Of course it's quite loud, but that's okay. We can put a silencer on this. This is producing just a ton though. Alright, I'm going to shut this down now. I would say that we're ready to do a trial run with this. It's been about a week since I did my initial testing on the DIY needle wheel. I actually took the pump this was installed and hooked it up to my protein skimmer for that whole week, just so I can get an idea of how much it changed my skimmer. In that time though, I never put the little locking key onto the impeller shaft. Now, while this impeller didn't move for the week it was on there, that doesn't mean that it's not going to do what my last one did, which was start to free spin after a few weeks. Therefore, I'm going to take this little piece of acrylic that I cut on the miter saw, shave it down with a Dremel tool. And once I have it with a good fit in here, I'll then cut it down to a short piece, place it in here, touch it with some acrylic glue, let it dry overnight, reinstall it, and then we are done. Let's go ahead and get this little piece of acrylic shaved down till we have a good fit. Then we'll get it touched with a little bit of glue and we're all set. With this piece of acrylic all machined, all we need to do now is just trim it up, put it in place permanently. Just gave it a little extra snug. Make sure it's pushed in good. I could actually see it coming out on the other side. I know it's pushed in here real nice. Now we're just gonna hit it. I have a tiny amount of acrylic glue in here. As you can see there's now a little acrylic key in the shaft for a shaft key. And that's it. That was the final step for the DIY needle wheel project. I'm gonna let this sit about 24 hours, install it back in the pump, and get my skimmer running again with it. Of course, the big question I'm sure everybody has is, of the two needle wheel impeller designs, does the single layer disc or the double layer disc perform better and produce more bubbles or finer bubbles? I'd honestly want to do a proper head-to-head test between these two in a competition to see which one will ultimately be the better needle wheel impeller. So stay tuned in the next few weeks, and I'm going to get that video ready and released out to everybody so you guys can see the actual results of this. Of course, if there's any questions on the DIY needle wheel project itself, or just general questions on the 1600 gallon system, fish or corals, go ahead and leave them down in the comments below. I try to get to comments as quickly as I can, so if I don't answer you right away, it might just take me a little while, but I try to get to all the comments as quickly as I can. Of course, if you liked today's video, please go ahead, give me that thumbs up, let me know that you liked it. I know that the DIY needle wheel project was definitely one of my longer series. They are a rather complex little piece of plastic to manufacture properly, and there's a lot of little tips and tricks which I hope I could relay to you if you decide to build a DIY needle wheel impeller this way. And even if you don't decide to build them this way, at least you have a little bit of an understanding of what the process is if you want to build one without the means of having like a CNC machine that can like 3D route this out, or a 3D printer. I tried to do it in a little bit more of an old-fashioned way, so I hope everybody enjoyed it. Thanks again for watching, everybody, and I will see you on the next video.